year 878. A heathen horde, led by the Danish Viking Guthrum, arrived on the shores of the island of Britain and managed to subdue almost all of the kingdoms that had been set up there by the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. There was just one kingdom that remained, the kingdom of the West Saxons, led by a king called Alfred. But Alfred had no idea how long he would remain in that position, having seen all of his kinsfolk and the Angles and the Jutes also subdued. So he trained his soldiers as best he could to resist the Danish Vikings when they arrived. And for a long time, it seemed like their forces were evenly matched. Alfred's forces won several battles, Guthrum's forces won several battles. And eventually there came a battle where the soldiers fought as well as each other, so much like each other that the battle went on for hours and hours and hours. Eventually, Alfred and Guthrum met and agreed a truce, a moment of peace, so that their soldiers could all have just one more night of rest. But the moment the Saxons had turned their backs on the Danish, Guthrum ordered his Vikings to slay them in the back. And Alfred turned around just in time to see many of his soldiers drop to the ground, and the field run red with their blood. Guthrum continued forward with his forces and set fire to Alfred's home, his fortress. Alfred could do nothing but run into a nearby forest, hearing the screams of his men and his servants behind him. That horrible stench driving him deep into the woods. He didn't feel much like a king anymore. For a long time, Alfred hid amongst those trees. He didn't really know what else he could do now. After a while, his skin started to get paler. His flesh got thinner. His face grew more gaunt. His clothes grew more ragged. He didn't look like he wore the clothes of a king. And his hair grew excessively long. No one would recognize him. And Alfred dared not reveal himself, not even to a Saxon in any of the Saxon villages around Wessex, lest word got out to the Danish and they came and burned that village to the ground just to get to him. After a time, though, Alfred found himself getting so starved and so desperately in need of a wash that he really had to just go and risk knocking on the doorway of one of the Saxon huts. He made up a story before he went over, a story about being a soldier in that final battle against Guthrum's Vikings, hoping that any Saxon who heard the story would take pity on him and let him in. He went up to one hut and knocked on the doorway and saw a woman very cautiously approach. But after she heard his story, she instantly welcomed him in with open arms, telling him that any Saxon was a friend to a Saxon, more like family even. And it really did warm Alfred's heart, knowing that's how his people felt about each other. As it turned out, the woman was actually really happy that Alfred had come by, because on her fire she had a metal grill where she was cooking some cakes for her husband. She also wanted to go out and get some mead for her husband though, and she hadn't been able to go out all the while she was cooking the cakes, just in case they burnt and her whole day's work was ruined. But now Alfred was there, she was able to leave him to tend the cakes while she went out to get the mead. And again, Alfred's heart was warmed. Not only had this woman given him such fine hospitality, but, well, she trusted him completely. So Alfred agreed to look after those cakes and make sure they didn't burn, while the woman went off to fetch her mead. Alfred sat next to the fire, pleased to be near some warmth for a change. Enjoyed a little bit of water, a little bit of bread. But as he looked into those flames, he couldn't help but be reminded of the flames that burned his fortress to the ground. And it began to fill him with such rage. He was furious. He was determined to one day beat Guthrum's forces back. He had no idea how, but it had to happen. It had to happen so that the Saxons could rule Wessex again, and maybe reclaim some of the other kingdoms for the Anglers and the Jutes, with whom they had been such close friends up until now. In fact, as Alfred watched the fire, and he remembered the hospitality that he had received from the woman, he began to think that actually he should be able to muster up some Saxon forces. It should be safe to reveal himself and trust his people with the knowledge of his existence. After all, the woman had shown him just how much Saxons looked out for each other. Perhaps that's what he needed to do. He needed to spread word through the Saxons, starting with this very woman and her husband, and let the word get out and muster all of the forces. Where could they muster? Alfred thought of the perfect spot. Egbert's stone. The stone that marked the reign of his grandfather, King Egbert. Who better to assemble by than the marker of the king who had once managed to rule every single one of the kingdoms on the island of Britain? What better place to muster the forces against the Danish and lead an attack that would take them by surprise? But what day to make this attack? As Alfred looked into those flames, he was reminded of a story from the book of the Christians, the Bible. It was a story in which tongues of fire had come down from heaven and licked the heads of the friends of Christ. That was the story of the Feast of Whitsun, a celebration for Christians that wasn't too long away. It would be the perfect time to launch an attack against the Danish, because of course they wouldn't expect the Saxons to attack on a Christian holy day. And so now Alfred could see it. Oh yes, he could see it was now the Vikings who were littering the ground with their bodies and their blood. It was going to be the Danish who would see their homes roaring with fire, and Alfred could smell it as well. He could smell them burning. It smelt like a sweet mixture of sugar and spices. And he could hear their cries as well. He could hear them crying, "What have you done to my cakes?" No, hang on, that didn't sound right. And then Alfred realized the woman had returned with her mead, and she was looking down at where her cakes had been. But now it looked like they were just lumps of charcoal. As quick as she could, the woman put out the fire with the mead that she'd only gone and bought for her husband. And she bellowed at Alfred, "What have you done? I left you one job, and you couldn't even do that!" Well, Alfred, he had never had anyone speak to him like this ever. He was a king. He wanted to put that woman back in her place. But then he realized this had been her whole day's work that she had trusted him with. And she was absolutely right. He'd ruined it. He had failed. So, Alfred was humble. He got down onto his knees and he said to the woman, "I am dearly, dearly sorry. I am such a foolish king." And when he looked back up at her face, he saw that she wore an expression rather like this. She had finally recognized him. It was Alfred, the king of the West Saxons. Her king. And now it was the woman's turn to drop down onto her knees and beg for Her Majesty's forgiveness for speaking to him in that fashion. But Alfred stood, took her hand and helped her back to her feet, and thanked her profusely for showing him such wisdom. First of all, the wisdom that Saxons could and should trust each other. Wisdom that Alfred was sure was going to help him muster up a force that would finally take their kingdom back from the Danish. But also the wisdom that he needed to concentrate on the small things as well. With that knowledge, Alfred was ready to take back his kingdom. And on the Feast of Whitsun, that was exactly what he did.